So good afternoon to everyone. I'm Dr. Mariana Orlandi, Executive Director of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. And it's a pleasure to welcome some old faces and some new faces to another lecture that we're co-hosting with the Salem Center for Policy at UT. We're very grateful for this collaboration. And we're very grateful for the faces that are back here, and again, for the ones that are new. Dr. Brooks is the Executive Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideas and Institutions and a lecturer in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. He is also someone with whom I shared 1 year in Princeton, even though it was 2020, it was a pretty good year during a postdoc, and he has stayed there. He liked it so much that he then stayed there. Dr. Shilo Brooks' bio, it's something you can easily find online. What I think you will not find online is that the lecture is given today is what he did with his life. From what I know of Dr. Brooks is that he took his studies at St. John's and the great books very seriously. He took ideas very seriously, philosophy, literature, and politics. And so you can see how he's a very young man with 260 students now at Princeton going to his lectures, where I hear he's all mic'd up as if it was a Joe Rogan telling the students about the great men of the past. So this is what he's going to do today with you. And so my encouragement, especially for the younger ones in the room, is to take these ideas as seriously as he did, because apparently it works. So Dr. Brooks, the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right. Hey, thanks everybody for having me. I was walking across the UT campus today. I'd never been here before, but I was born and raised in Texas. And when I got to Princeton, everybody's like, "Oh, it's going to be amazing. It's Princeton University going to be amazing." And I walked across campus and I thought, whatever. This is not that great. But I got to tell you, walking across this campus, I'd never seen the bell tower in person. I felt, just as a person who's from around here, like a sense of gravitas, really, I almost got nervous. I could have never got into the University of Texas as an undergraduate. I was not a good high school student. I'm still not a good student. But so being here is really special to me because all the smart kids in my high school got to come here and they'd come home and tell stories about how awesome it was to all of us guys who were just, working construction, working at the mall. So I appreciate the opportunity. It's a real honor to be back home and be at the university. I'm going to do something that's a little bit odd today, I suspect, for an academic, and that is I go to like 40 academic talks a semester. It's just unrelenting. It's constant academic talks and dinners. And I was thinking, what have I never seen anybody talk about who's come to an academic talk? And what I've never seen academics really talk about in a public setting is their teaching. And so what I'd like to do today, since it's Friday, it's the lunch hour, is talk to you about a course, the one Mariana mentioned, that has really changed my life. I think has changed the fabric of Princeton in some ways. A lot, very surprising to me. I'd like to kind of walk you through what that course is, the story of its emergence, and the phenomenon that it's become. I'll get to these folks here in a minute, but let me just start by kind of telling a story about how I arrived at Princeton and how this all came about. So I got there in 2022, and one of the things they asked me to do was teach a course on statesmanship. And I thought, okay, let me think about how to do that. I'd been at the University of Colorado for a period of time doing various things on the great books. And so they said to me, we have this topics course. And if you're not an academic, what a topics course is it's a course that each semester its topic changes, right? So it can be, this one was topics in American statesmanship. So people had done Woodrow Wilson, or people had done the founding, or people had done Lincoln, this sort of thing. And I thought, well, what would I do with this topics course? And what they were doing was they were sort of testing me out, like what kind of things would he teach and how would he do? And I was feeling them out and these sorts of things. And so I offered this course in 2022, and it was great. There was about 48 students, 50 students. It was in a room about this size. We had the time of our life in that course. And then the craziest thing happened, which was the following, the following spring, I'm sitting on a train with the director of the James Madison program, Robert George, and myself. We're going to DC for something, and I get a phone call from the department, and they say, have you looked at your course enrollment lately? And I say, no, I have not. And we get on the internet, they're on the train, and it's like a stock ticker. It's like crazy explosion. And I'm thinking, what do I do? And I turn to Robbie and I say, what do we do? And do we cap it? They're asking me if I want to cut off the spigot. And if you know Professor George, he said, let's see how big this thing can get. Like, this is going to be huge. We're going to take over. So that's what we did. But the Princeton newspaper wrote a story that semester about the classes at Princeton that had been most dropped and added and grown. So let me share with you some of the graphs from that story. So you can see a picture, a snapshot of what's going on at the Ivy League. So these are the classes, as you can see, by enrollment, most popular at Princeton. So let me start with Paul 396. That's not my course. That's a course on international organizations. Princeton has a really good school of public policy. It used to be called the Woodrow Wilson School. Now it's called the School of Public and International Affairs. That course is required for those majors in addition to a lot of politics majors. Plus, it's just, from my understanding, a really interesting course. So it's very popular. But then you can see engineering, right? Obviously, this is now a snapshot of the interests of students in the Ivy League. Computer science, okay? Physics. There's an English course up there, English 304. That's interesting. You wouldn't expect an English course to be among the most enrolled courses at the university. I will say this, that course's title is Children's Literature. So take that for what you will. Whether we ought to be studying children's literature at the best university in the world, I leave to your discretion. But so you get engineering, you get physics, you get mathematics, you get computer science, COS, you get neuroscience, you get molecular biology. But there's a course up there that says POL 332. That's my course, right? Look at the bottom. That's the line for my course over the years. This is that broken out, right? So something happened. This is not, if this was a stock, it'd have been a great idea to invest in that stock. You know what I mean? So something happened. I don't fully understand what happened. One of the things that I'm trying to do today is figure out what happened, because I haven't talked about this. It's not something I've thought deeply about, but I'd like to kind of begin with you to think about what might have happened. But as you can see here, this course was chronically under-enrolled to the point where, in some years, it was practically identical to zero, maybe 2 or 3 students. I arrived in the spring of 2023. No one knew my name. Nobody knew me from anybody. So that particular iteration of this course, that was due just to the course description, which I'll share with you in a moment. Apparently, it looked interesting because there was a spike there. That up top is last spring, right? The second time I offered the course. I present this to you because, my understanding of the mission of the Austin Institute is, at least in part, that it's concerned with the formation of character. This course is concerned with the formation of character. So it looks like I met, at least to me, some kind of demand. The other reason I introduced this to you is that I'm very interested in the civic centers that are springing up around the country, one of which is the School of Civic Life and Leadership here at the University of Texas. One question, of course, that those centers ask is, how do we attract students after all these departments didn't exist 2 years ago? So I suspect that there's something in this phenomenon that happened at Princeton that's, if it can be isolated, maybe it can be reproduced, because something's going on here, right? This is not just like chance. And so the students are getting something that they should be getting. They're not, there's something's missing in their education that they didn't know until they got it, and then they really liked it, and then they told everybody, you need to go get this thing. And if we can isolate that, I think that's one of the many ways that we can improve and perhaps rehabilitate higher education. So this is a photograph of that day on the first or second day of class. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. This is halfway up, right? So take that, double it, and expand the sides, because there's sides there too. That's the hardest thing I ever did in my life, is stand in front of 300 people 2 days a week. with no notes and talk to them about the things that I'm going to talk to you about. It was an unbelievable experience. I'm not of the Ivy League, right? I didn't go to these schools. I never saw myself as somebody who would be at one of these schools. And so to step in front of that classroom every day was extraordinary. It was an honor. It was an opportunity. It was also very intimidating. It made me better. I think it would make anybody better who had to do that. And so, this is what I had to face. My rules were no slides. I would only have a map, no slides like I'm doing today, and no notes. I would walk a tightrope. I would get up with the book alone, and I would talk about the book based on my own memory, my own mind. I would select the passages that moved me that day. I would say the things I said such that day, that was how I felt. Maybe my 7-year-old daughter didn't sleep last night and I was mad. Maybe my administrative workload was high and I didn't get to prepare as much. Whatever it was, I wanted the students to see me walk a tightrope. I wanted them to see me honestly engage with these books in an unrehearsed way, to struggle with them, to struggle with myself. And I wanted my own feelings, my own thoughts to color any given interpretation of the book that day without being rehearsed. I wanted it to be new and fresh to me and to them. And I got to tell you, it kept me excited and kept me on my toes. And they loved it. They loved kind of seeing it every day. So what I'd like to do now is walk you through the elements of this thing so that together maybe we can isolate exactly what it is, or I can at least speculate about exactly what it is that caused that rise in that graph, which is so astonishing to me. And I'll say this, it went from being, one of the lowest enrolled courses to one of the highest enrolled courses. That was great for my program, the James Madison program, because as I said, I direct the James Madison program with Robbie George, who's a very eminent scholar of constitutional law. His courses are big. He's got about 150 people in them. So between the two of us, we had 450 Princeton students. That is a very, very large, between two people, that's a lot of people to reach at an excellent university, by the way. And so I think that these things are, there are lessons here, things to think about with respect to the way that we all are trying to think about higher education and what can be done to improve it, especially as it relates to the liberal arts. So one of the first questions I asked myself in creating this course, and this is the kind of part of the question that I get most often from most of the people who have heard about this, is, what is this thing? How did you make it? What's going on? Like, I read about this, or somebody told me about this. What is this thing? And so I'd like to explain it to you. So one of the first questions I asked myself whenever they said, we want you to create an elective, and we want it to kind of revolve around the topic of leadership, ambition, and statesmanship, was, all right, this is a real opportunity. Create an elective. It's an elective, by the way. It's not required for anything. So all the folks you saw enrolled took that course by choice, not by necessity, right? It wasn't like the international organizations course where you need it for your major. They're coming to me voluntarily and spending one of their precious elective credits. So I thought, all right, do I want this course to be a survey? There's a lot of great survey courses out there. I've taken them, you've taken them. I didn't really want it to be a survey in the sense that we would read a group of people in chronological order. That didn't appeal to me. That's done really well. And so I thought, no, I'm going to nix that one. Do I want it to be a period study? Maybe we do 19th century writers on statesmanship or ambition or something like that. But there's a lot of great courses in our department and around the university that really focus on that. So I nixed that one. Maybe I want it to be an exploration of a question, the question of justice, right? What is justice, right? Love, what is love? I love those sorts of courses. Those are done well all over the country, by the way, here and elsewhere. There's really good courses that take that approach. I had taught them before, so I didn't really want to do that. What about a deep dive into a single thinker's work? Maybe we just read, as Plato's Republic or something of this kind. I had done that before, and again, I thought, no, this is an opportunity at Princeton to do something different, to really challenge these students, to take them by surprise. And so I chose not to read a single book, not to dive into a single thinker, say 2 or 3 works of Locke or something of that nature. But I had in my head this quotation from Alexis de Tocqueville, who I happen to love. He says this, and I've edited it for my purposes. The first striking thing about the United States, and I say, and Princeton, is the huge number of people bent on escaping their original condition. The second is the small number of great ambitions that stand out amid this universal outpouring of ambition. This desire to rise apparently gnaws at every American, and I would say also every Princeton student, yet almost no one seems to nurse vast hopes or aim very high. I'll get to the second paragraph in a minute. One of the things that surprised me the most when I got there, because I didn't teach my first semester, was these are the best kids, supposedly. I mean, UT is, is better, obviously, but these are the best kids that there are, and everybody wants to be in middle management. That's it. That's what we're doing here. We're going to Princeton so we can go into middle management, or they want to go to Deloitte, or they want to go to Goldman Sachs, and they will, and they do. But the talent that I could see in some of these young people was shocking to me, and I kept thinking, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? That's what you want to do. I didn't even go to a school like this. I could have never gotten into a school like this, and all I could think about when I was 19 was being the ruler of the world. Where's your ambition? Let's get this done, right? And so I couldn't get this Tocqueville quote out of my head, and I thought, well, that's what I want to speak to. That's an illness, whether it's something about our culture, or as Tocqueville says, democracy in the United States in general has this pathology, we can debate. But he says, I confess that for democratic societies, I am far less afraid of audacity of desire than mediocrity, meaning I'm not scared so much that Napoleon's going to arise. I'm scared that you're going to get kind of a mediocre type who proliferates throughout the regime, such that, leadership, even prudent civic leadership at the local level is just not likely. What's most to be feared, it seems to me, is that the spark and grandeur of ambition might be swallowed up by the ceaseless petty occupations of private life, and that the human passion might subside and diminish at the same time, leaving society looking more tranquil but also less impressive as time goes by. And I could see, my students in a way occupying themselves with what Tocqueville calls quite derisively the ceaseless petty occupations of private life. What that might mean in the 19th century is certainly very different from what it means today, but they're basically binging on YouTube or whatever, come on guys, or Call of Duty or whatever the case may be. Meanwhile, the regime's burning down, so let's get at it. What are you guys doing? So I wanted to be for these students one of these machines where you just shock them to life, like in the ER. That's kind of their ambition. I mean, what are we doing here after all? So I couldn't get that out of my head. I'm a man of the 19th century, I admit. My greatest failing is that I love Nietzsche. It's my greatest moral failing. I apologize for that. Right now, I've always loved Nietzsche. I've known Eric for 20 years. He can confirm this. I can't get the guy out of my head, and he's been wonderful. I wrote a book on him, which I had a wonderful time doing. But these lines also echoed kind of in my heart, and they always have ever since I read Nietzsche's essay, The Use and Disadvantage of History for Life. It's an essay on education. And it begins with this quote from Goethe where Goethe says, moreover, I hate everything that only instructs me without increasing or immediately stimulating my own activity, right? So Goethe is lamenting there the kind of learning that's merely for learning's sake rather than for the sake of internalizing and becoming a part of you such that it changes your life and defines your activity in some way. Nietzsche then reflects on that quote and he says, look, my purpose in this essay about education, he's talking about history and people who read history and teach history, is to demonstrate why instruction without stimulation, knowledge that inhibits activity, history is a costly intellectual superfluous force and luxury, must, in accordance with Goethe's words, arouse our intense hatred. We need history for life and for action, not for the easy withdrawal from life and action. I love that quotation. I love that essay, largely because Nietzsche is saying something like, the kind of things that you imbibe as pedagogical materials ought not just to weigh you down. You shouldn't just fill yourself with facts such that you become this giant walking encyclopedia who recites facts that don't really mean anything to anyone. And maybe you have the whole compendium of the French Revolution committed to memory, but so what? There's a way of learning with the right sorts of books, and it doesn't have to be every course. I love those courses where you just study the history of a thing. I'm not dogging on those at all, but I think there's a place for a course which is meant not just to transmit disciplinary competence or mastery of the subject matter, but to arouse you, to bring you to life such that you internalize those books and they change you. They become part of your DNA. And this is what Nietzsche complains about. So I thought that was in some ways compatible with my desire to respond to Tocqueville and say something to these ambitious young people. And so the other component of this is that, I grew up in a place, I was born in Brownfield, Texas, about 6 hours and 15 minutes west of the place I stand. There was not a lot of folks who were looking at books. Good people, salt of the earth people, I love them. I'd go back, if there was a university in Brownfield, Texas, I'd be teaching there tomorrow, right? The problem is there's not. And I didn't have a lot of access to a lot of this stuff. I came from also a family that was, a little bit broken and these sorts of things. So I didn't have a lot of people advising me and guiding me. But one of the things that I loved, that I found as a teenager, was I could read the memoir, the letters, the autobiographies of great people, and it was in a way like they were my teachers, like they were my parents. It was the most bizarre thing. Seeking life advice, right? I'd open up F. Scott Fitzgerald's letters. I can remember this like it was yesterday, and read all the letters he wrote to his daughter, Scotty. And he was telling her, here's what you should read, and here's what you should do. And I didn't have anybody telling me that. So I turned to these guys, right? And that really changed my life. And so I thought, I wonder if I can communicate that as part of this project to transmit, first of all, inspire ambition. Second, to communicate subject matter that one uses for life. And third, to make it such that that subject matter is the advice and the great words and thoughts of people addressing the students through me, right? So I wanted to incorporate these sorts of texts. So with that in mind, I think one of the questions anybody who's creating a course from whole cloth in this discipline has to ask themselves is, how many books should we read, right? How many books should we read? I wasn't sure, but I knew this, that my students typically read op-eds, stories on the internet whose lifespan is like a gnat. Let me ask you this question. Do you remember the op-ed that you read 3 weeks ago? Like 3 Fridays ago? Do you remember it? What about 5 Fridays ago? What about 20 Fridays ago? Do you remember which news stories on the internet exactly? No, of course you don't, because it's junk. It's potato chips. It goes in one ear and out the other. It's good for the minute that it's on your screen, and then it's gone. But if you were in high school, go back to high school, did you read a novel that changed your life? Can you name it? Was it Grapes of Wrath? Was it The Great Gatsby? What was it? It was something, right? You remember that today. And when you're 60, you're gonna be like, man, we read the best novel sophomore year. You know what I mean? A book is a different thing. It lives differently in the soul than an op-ed or than a news article or something like that, especially if it's an extraordinary book written by the deepest of people and the deepest of souls. So I knew that I wanted to introduce my students to a kind of reading, a kind of literature, a kind of text, which would stick on their ribs like meat and oatmeal for life. You know what I mean? And so that was rule number one, was that we get rid of the potato chip way of consuming information such that you can't even remember the article that you read yesterday. I mean, how long are TikTok videos even? It's fast. Do you remember 3 TikTok videos ago even? Probably not, right? So that rapidity is a real problem for sustained reflection. Of course, when asking myself these questions, like when I was a kid and I didn't really have anybody to turn to, so I would turn to the advice of people who I were under the impression were very extraordinary people. I could not get, I love Churchill, and I, of course, have read his many memoirs, My Early Life, but in addition to his history of the Second World War, his history of the Boer War, this, which really moved me. He says this about young people and their reading habits. It's a mistake to read too many good books when you're young. A man once told me that he had read all the books that mattered. Cross-questioned, he appeared to have read a great many, but they seemed to have made only a slight impression. And we all know somebody like this. I'm gonna tell you, this is the average faculty member. They've read 500 books. They can't recall a single thing from any of them, as far as, a lot of the time, or articles. They just, digest the literature and the literature review, but then it just doesn't sit. So he's saying when you're young, I've known people who have read a lot of books, he says, but when you're young, you gotta do things different. He says, how many had he understood? How many had entered into his mental composition? How many had been hammered on the anvils of his mind and afterwards ranged in an armory of bright weapons ready to hand? It's a great pity to read a book too soon in life. That thought has always stuck with me, namely that there's a moment in life that might be more appropriate or less appropriate for reading a book. The first impression is the one that counts. And if it's a slight one, it may be all that can be hoped for. A later and second perusal may recoil from a surface already hardened by premature contact. Young people should be careful in their reading, as old people in eating their food. They should not eat too much. They should chew it well. That principle has been the principle by which I've been able to learn in my life, and I wanted the students to see that, and I wanted to follow Churchill's advice here that there's a time in life, if you get a book too soon, it might be that that's a great book, and you'll never know it because and I've had students do this. We're going to read Aristotle. Oh, I hate Aristotle. What do you mean you hate Aristotle? You're 17. Like, you don't even know. You don't know anything about Aristotle, right? And it might have been if you read that later, maybe you would have loved Aristotle. I don't know. You need a little more life. Or a novel. I hate that novel. What do you mean you hate that novel? That, the person who wrote that's like a light of literature in the world, and you hate it? So I just think, your judgment's skewed. And so I wanted to be sure to select books that would speak to young people at the right time, what I judge to be the right time, which is hard to do, at the right time, and that there wouldn't be too many. So that was one animating principle. Another question I asked myself was, in what spirit should these books be read? Some of the best historians that I know are colleagues of mine. They are really, really smart people from whom everyone should take a course. But first of all, I can't out-history them. Second, I didn't want to, because of Nietzsche, because he weighs on my soul, I didn't want to just communicate historical facts about statesmen and leadership or anything like that. There's also sort of this theoretical or philosophic inquiry, a kind of sustained philosophic inquiry. That appeals to me, but I didn't just want to encourage reflection, I wanted to encourage activity. Then there's the question of civics education, which is on the minds of many of my friends right now. Did I want this to be a kind of acquainting young people with the elements of, say, the executive power of the regime? Did I want to engage in something more akin to what I would call liberal education, which I think is in a way compromised or at the university right now? For guidance here, I turned to this man who wrote 3 autobiographies. 3, you only really need one, right? He wrote his life 3 times. That in itself is a great question to ask when approaching Frederick Douglass, by the way. Why would a man need to write his life 3 times? You only live one of them. But he said this in his first autobiography, written at age 27, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. It's about education. It's always stuck with me as something that I've read this when I was very young, and it was part of the reason that I wanted to seek an education. So he was a slave. He was born into slavery. And at one point in his life, he got off the plantation and got sent to Baltimore, which is at the time, a really bustling city. He got sent to a couple there who had never owned slaves before. So at the beginning, they were very kind to him, especially the woman named Sophia Auld. What ended up happening was that his master saw Sophia, his wife, teaching young Frederick how to read. And Frederick Douglass says in this narrative, I'll never forget what he said to her when she was trying to teach me how to read. He said this, if you teach that bad word that I'm not going to say, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. These words, Douglass says, sank deep into my heart and stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and fixed purpose at whatever trouble to learn how to read. So he didn't know why this was happening. He didn't understand, but he said, it clicked in that point that somehow books and reading were the pathway to me, to freedom. And he says this, nothing seemed to make my mistress more angry than to see me with a newspaper. I have had her rush at me with a face made all up of fury and snatch from me a newspaper in a manner that fully revealed her apprehension. She was an apt woman, and a little experience soon demonstrated, and I love this line, to her satisfaction, that education and slavery are incompatible with each other. I wanted the students to feel that. I wanted them to feel, in a way, that they were slaves, that they were ignorant, and that they needed to be freed from something, that the education would be the pathway to a certain kind of freedom. That's the spirit in which I wanted these books to be read. That's the genuine spirit of a liberating education, a liberal education, one that takes convictions, like the young Frederick Douglass had, that the order of the world is that white people are on top, black people are on the bottom. That's natural, and that's just how it is. Never questioned it, right? And then he realizes that there are alternative accounts of the way the world works. He goes and finds an abolitionist newspaper, the Columbian Orator, another called the Liberator, and reads these and sees in these newspapers alternative accounts of the way the world can work. There's a dialogue that he read in the Columbian Orator between a slave and his master, and it's a kind of Socratic dialogue in which the slave ends up disproving to the master the naturalness of slavery. He had never seen anything like that before. He teaches himself to read by, when his mistress and master leave the house, they have a young boy. He sneaks into that young boy's room when everybody's gone, takes his grammar books and starts tracing the letters one by one. And then he goes out into the street and he takes bread and puts it in his pocket. And when he sees little boys in the street, he'll say, "Hey kid, come here." The little boy comes over. He says, "Take this stick." And he'll carve a letter in the sand, a G or something like that. And he'll say, "Look, I'll give you a piece of bread if you will teach me another letter. Or finish that letter with a word." So you might put G, and then the little kid might put OOD, good. And he'd say, "What does that say?" Good, right? And he would do this daily and figure this out, right? And so he managed to put together the whole alphabet, teach himself to read by cunning, and become arguably the greatest orator of his time, rivaled only by Abraham Lincoln, who had a deep admiration for him. And he was totally self-educated, by the way, so was Abraham Lincoln. But anyway, so I wanted that spirit. I wanted the kids to feel that education was that important, that they are enchained, and that these books are in a way the pathway to a kind of freedom which they could not envision. What kind of books should you read in a course like this? Like what sorts of, how should I begin to think about what these books are? Again, what I did is that I turned not to studies on pedagogy, not to what other people in the department were doing, but I've done what I've always done in my life, which is turn to people who are superior to me, to teach me, to guide me in all aspects of my life, whether it's my professional life, my intellectual life, or in this case, how I should teach a course. Theodore Roosevelt's autobiography is amazing. I read this book in graduate school just of my own one lazy summer in Boston, and I knew I had found a soulmate. I've included the picture of Teddy reading in his cowboy hat for you here at the University of Texas. Of course, he is famous for having gone west to the Dakota Badlands. But this quote right here comes from a rare book. It's not in print anymore. I have a copy, the original copy. I paid a whole bunch of money for it because I love the man, called A Book Lover's Holidays in the Open. What a wonderful title, by the way, A Book Lover's Holidays in the Open. He says this, and it's something that stuck with me. If anyone finds that he never reads serious literature, if all his reading is frothy and trashy, but a lot of your reading is frothy and trashy. I tell my students, you're all reading the frothy, trashy romantasy. Whatever it is you're reading, it's all trash. You would do well to try to train yourself to like books that general agreement of cultivated and sound-thinking persons, namely me, cultivated and sound-thinking person, has placed among the classics. It is as discreditable to the mind to be unfit for sustained mental effort as it is to the body of a young man to be unfit for sustained physical effort. Let man or woman, young man or girl, read some good author, say Gibbon or Macaulay, until sustained mental effort brings power to enjoy the books worth enjoying. When this has been achieved, the man can soon trust himself to pick out for himself the particular good books which appeal to him. So I wanted us to read books that when you read them, you would get a taste for what a good book was, so that when you left my classroom, your education could continue on the basis of the taste that we had cultivated together and gotten you out of your frothy, trashy youth. So that's, one aspect of what sorts of books should we read. We've got how many books should we read and what spirit should they be read. I love this woman. She does not get enough credit in our culture. When I ask my students who the first female Supreme Court justice was, they universally say Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Not the truth. Sandra Day O'Connor, first female on the Supreme Court. Introducing you to her if this is your first time. One of the beautiful things about Justice O'Connor is that she went to Stanford at a time when there was a really robust Western civilization curriculum. There's a beautiful biography of her written by one of my colleagues. It's called First. This is an excerpt from it. In her own life, when she had gotten off the court, she was looking back on her life. She looked back on the history of Western Civ course, which is a kind of Plato to the present day survey course required of all Stanford freshmen. She said this, I loved it. I thought it was wonderful. Something registered with me. And so she devoted hours in the Western Civ reading room on the quad to studying these great books. You should ask yourself the question, what the heck does reading the great books at Stanford on the quad have to do with becoming a Supreme Court justice, right? She would say, and did give some indication that the answer to that is this. When you're on the court, today, what's coming at you is taxes, tax law. Tomorrow, it's something about medicine. The next day, it's something about the auto industry. The next day, it's something about, I don't know, Congress. It's just the variety of subjects that you have to pass judgment on that matters for this country forever is massive. What the great books do is introduce you to a wide variety of issues and inculcate a certain kind of curiosity, the kind of curiosity that's required when you need to ask the right questions of people around you so that you can pass judgment in an informed way on a variety of topics. She talked about the curiosity that is inculcated in her, and she would always say that curiosity is among the primary features that a judge needs because so many things come before you about which you are not an expert. And so, the great books, in a certain sense, they both cultivate a foundation for judgment in addition to just making you curious about the world and opening it up to you and making that task sound exciting rather than a burden. So she's really wonderful. Machiavelli, extraordinary man, right? If you've ever read The Prince, the reason I love it is that it's like a letter. He often uses the term you. It in fact begins with a letter. But when you're reading it, you sometimes feel like he's talking to me. He'll say, you should do, or you, and you're thinking, he's writing a letter to me. He's also among the greatest teacher of leadership, in quotation marks, whatever that word means, around. This passage, I love this passage. It's a passage I found in my undergraduate career reading Machiavelli. He says, for princes, to exercise the mind, they should read the histories and consider in them the actions of excellent men. Above all, they should do as some excellent man has done in the past who found someone to imitate, who had been praised and glorified before him, whose exploits and actions he always kept beside himself. He's talking about a book that you always keep beside yourself, and it's somebody who you want to imitate. Maybe you love George Washington, and you go get that biography of George Washington, and by the time you're 27 years old, the pages are falling out of it because you've read it so many times because you have modeled some aspect of yourself after him. And so he says Alexander the Great kept Homer's Iliad under his pillow and read it, right? Caesar read Greek histories and imitated Alexander. Scipio read Xenophon, interesting, I'll come back to him in a moment, the life of Cyrus written by Xenophon, and learned from that, right? And that's a complicated passage and we can go into it maybe in the Q&A. But at any rate, Machiavelli talks about the need to read books of histories of great people, learn from them, imitate them. This was in keeping with my whole view for the class, right? So that was quite helpful. And then finally, Nietzsche says essentially what Machiavelli says. He says history can be written only by the experienced and superior person. The person whose experience of some things is not greater and superior to the experience of all other people will not be able to interpret the great and superior things of the past. What he's saying there is this. You can read a history, and I love them, by historians. I just read Edmund Morris's Theodore Roosevelt trilogy, the first of which it won the Pulitzer Prize. It's amazing. I recommend it to you all. It's called The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. But Edmund Morris wrote that. You know what I love more than reading Edmund Morris's histories? I love reading Theodore Roosevelt's histories. I love reading Winston Churchill's histories. And that's what Nietzsche's getting at here, that there's something in the soul of the person who has him or herself risen to the heights of historic proportions. When that person sits down to write history, it's richer. There's just something about, they're acquainted with something that the historian in their study at the local university, typing on their computer, that's a different way of accessing the past and its richness than when Churchill sits down to write the life of Marlborough, or when Theodore Roosevelt sits down to write, as he did, a biography of Oliver Cromwell or a 4-volume history of the American West. It's a different sort of thing. The other thing that's baked into this is that one of the things that you get when you read a history that's written by a person who acted in it. So, one of the things you get maybe is some bias. You get, well, this is really just Churchill reinterpreting the Second World War to make himself look good. But you get something that's really extraordinary that almost outweighs the bias. After all, the bias is pretty interesting because then you get to see what Churchill wants to lie about, which is itself an interesting piece of information. But you get the inner life of the person coming out on the page, such that if I read a history of the Second World War written by someone who was external to it, they are telling that story in an external way to it. Churchill lived through the events, so I'm getting a certain emotional richness in the telling of the story that might color it in a certain way, but that I wouldn't trade because he's telling the story from the inside. Namely, the history lives in him. He was part of it. And so Nietzsche is saying there's a kind of elevation in learning when you access learning from that dimension rather than the kind of scholarly dimension. And so I wanted to incorporate that. And I come back to Xenophon because he does precisely this. He is the quintessential, he's a student of Socrates. I can explain this here in a moment, but he's the quintessential ancient example of a person who was himself a general who led 10,000 Greeks. And he's I'll talk about this in a moment, why I'm saying this, but he led 10,000 Greeks out of Persia and wrote a book called the Anabasis of Cyrus, which is in a certain sense a kind of autobiography of his exploits in Persia. What's extraordinary about him is that he's also a student of Socrates. And so you have in this person, he's the only ancient example I could think of where you have a person who is both educated by arguably the greatest educator ever to have lived, Socrates, in addition to having been a political man whose primary genre, he did write dialogues and other things, but whose primary genre of writing is really biography and autobiography. He writes a history, kind of historical novel of Cyrus the Great. He writes memoirs of Socrates called the Memorabilia. He writes his own Anabasis. He writes a book called the Hellenica, which picks up after Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. And so he is that kind of historian in my view. So I wanted to make sure he was there, and I thought there's some unity that's starting to show itself. So let me now just conclude by saying which books are included and why. You can see, although the light is not quite right, that I have a trigger warning for the faculty members in the room. This is an unconventional curriculum you're about to see. The disciplinary rules that would apply in normal departments don't apply. Historical rules don't apply. I'm sorry. I did not consult academic journals or tables of data or whatever the case may be to make this course. And character formation is emphasized above mastery of the subject matter. I said it out loud, and I'm sorry about that, but that's just the case that this is true of this course. So what happened was I realized this, that the people who I was looking to inform me about the course were precisely the people who needed to be on the syllabus, right? Because my goal was to educate these students with respect to that Tocquevillian question of ambition by using the words of people who had lived life at the heights and had reflected on it. And so I sort of saw these are the people who I take as my teachers for whatever value that's worth. It seems to have, it's been a good guide for me. I love these books. I know I'll speak passionately about them to the students. It's not like I have to teach this course because we all need it for our major and somebody's got to teach it every year. This is my heart and soul. And so the course consists of just these 5 figures. This is the oddest and unlikeliest grouping in all of higher education. Find me another course where Sandra Day O'Connor and Machiavelli are read in the same course. There's not one, right? I'm not trying to do the thing that you do in a lot of courses. In a way, I'm trying to tell a story. These authors all lined up together, read side by side, provide a platform of advice, of reflection on the deep life of the political individual in all of its glory and all of its tragedy. And the students really connect to that. And one of the things that appears in all of these books is the great person of ambition in their youth. We read about these people when they were young. What did they want? What did they think? How did they get to where they were? What were they doing when they were 21 years old? The students are very interested in hearing that. And so we begin with Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, primarily because that book is arguably the greatest book on the political life and ambition, in my view, ever written. I use that book to criticize ambition. It starts out with tremendous promise. Young Cyrus is the greatest talent, has the most extraordinary political nature of any human being ever to have lived. By the time, and the students are like, that's him, that's who I want to be. I'm going to be that guy right there. By the time you get to the end of the book, things are not looking that good for Cyrus, right? He's got a gigantic empire over which he seems to be a tyrant who has enslaved his people in some pretty disturbing ways. Not only that, he himself on his deathbed is not, you wouldn't call him happy. If we had the book in front of us, I would read out loud to you what he says. But he says something like, You should say and do the things about me that you would say and do about someone who was happy. Does that mean you were happy, or we're just saying you were happy? Like, what's the deal? And so I take ambition as a starting point and then critique it by showing that there's this political pathology that's primarily in its character lustful for love. Cyrus wants to be the beloved in a certain sense of the whole world. He wants everybody to praise him. Cyrus is the greatest, to love him. And so he's got this sort of erotic sickness by way of which he's pursuing conquest of the whole world so that he can become, and there's a faculty member here, Lorraine Pengel, who's written a beautiful article on this, a god who gets the kind of love that a god would get. That's a bizarre thing, right? That's psychotic, right? And so I try to confuse the students in that way with this biographical writing written by a man who himself lived the life. In fact, at one point in Xenophon's own life, his men encouraged him, and he was tempted to found a city, and he would have been an extraordinary ruler, let me tell you. But for whatever reason, maybe he consulted the gods, or maybe he decided that wasn't the life for him, he turned down that life and ended up being just a writer, a private man. And so, he's got his own story that I try to tell. Of course, Machiavelli says in The Prince, I showed it to you, that princes should read the histories of great men, and the only book whose title appears in The Prince, or at least is invoked, is Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, although Machiavelli, for reasons I won't discuss here, calls it The Life of Cyrus. I also thought Machiavelli is, of course, this teacher that everyone associates with this sort of stuff, so he's got to be on the syllabus. He's the most famous. We then turn to Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt wrote an essay called Promise and Performance, in which he says, if you want to be a Machiavellian leader, it's not going to go well for you. And he criticizes not only the Machiavellian type, this is the President of the United States. He's not quite president yet, but he will be. He criticizes the Machiavellian type, but he also says that you can have a people who are duped by a Machiavellian type, and what that reveals is the low quality of the people. And so he calls Americans to rise. And he says, look, you must rise or else you will have Machiavellian indecent leadership because you are not smart enough to see the difference between decency and indecency. We can't even blame it all on Machiavelli. We're going to blame some of it on you. And so it's a very interesting essay from a man who went on to make his career on being America's teacher. We read his autobiography in which he talks about the importance of cultivating character. Right? That's a word we don't use anymore, but he is unashamedly a cultivator of character. There's a beautiful essay he wrote for Outlook magazine called Character and Success that we read. In his autobiography, he reveals himself to be a curious, extraordinary little boy who's asthmatic, who suffers, who is bookish, who overcomes that suffering by way of intense physical exercise, who loves the natural world so much that he goes in New York City as a boy and sees a dead seal on the side of the street. And he's like 6 years old. He goes home, gets a tape measure, and is like measuring this dead seal on the side of the street in New York City. And his mom is like, what are you doing? And he starts bringing home dead squirrels and rats and birds and keeping them in shoeboxes in his room. And the maid is terrified. And he's just got this whole world, inner life that really models what an ideal sort of statesman, at least in my view, a man of letters who's also got political ambition would look like. And so we look at him as an example. I've already talked to you about Frederick Douglass, who's an extraordinary man whose autobiography begins with him not even knowing when he was born or what his name is. Think about that starting point for a minute. I always tell the students, you can measure greatness by how high you get. Napoleon, Cyrus, top of the world. Maybe that's how we should do it. But there's also another way to measure it, which is how far you travel in a lifetime. Nobody traveled as far as Frederick Douglass. Nobody in this room or my classroom was ever enslaved. He was. And yet, here Douglass is, toward the end of his life, in the White House with Abraham Lincoln shaking hands. Think about the arc of that life for a minute. Think about the kind of soul that can live that life. Think about the kind of man who could write the volumes of extraordinarily beautiful speeches that Douglass did by teaching himself to write as a slave. He didn't go to Princeton. He didn't go to the University of Texas. You see what I mean? And so I want them to see what are the things that made Douglass Douglass. And so we look at that. And then finally, we look at Sandra Day O'Connor. She has this beautiful biography of her childhood called Lazy Bee. She was not a woman to speak about the court, her decisions, herself in public. So there's not a lot about her She's this old kind of person who we don't have much anymore in the world of influencers, who thought that being reserved when you're in public office was the proper, dignified manner with which you should conduct yourself. She only really ever published these two autobiographical reflections. The first one, Lazy Bee, is a story of her growing up on a cattle ranch on the border of New Mexico and Arizona, and it consists of reflections on what she learned as a little girl that, in a certain sense, toughened her up for the journey from that ranch to becoming the first female on the Supreme Court. One of the reasons that Reagan loves her is that they get in his office whenever he said to America, if you elect me for a second term, I will put a woman on the court. The abortion issue is a problem for him, and so he wants to put a woman on the court. They sit in his office, and he says, I hear you ride horses, And so she's able to connect with him pretty immediately. But, one of the things that happens in Lazy Bee is that there's these crazy stories of cowboys. There's this great story of one of them who's getting a root canal, and they take a wire that they use for branding, and they put it in the fire. And this guy literally puts a wire into his tooth, and like the smoke's coming up, and just numbs that thing right out of there, just gives himself a root canal with the hot wire right there. And she talks about seeing this and what that what that meant. And so she cultivates a certain kind of mettle and gravitas that's similar to Roosevelt, the kind of manliness and these sorts of things that Roosevelt preaches, but in a decidedly unmanly package in Justice O'Connor, who is a woman who must also do justice. That's her name. She decides some of the most difficult, controversial decisions on the court about abortion, Bush versus Gore, affirmative action. She is the swing vote. You may not like how she voted, you may love how she voted, but she had to decide. And that's more than any of us have to do who sit and throw pot shots and write our op-eds that people consume in 90 seconds. She's a different kind of woman. And so I wanted the students to see that. So this is the course description. It's basically exactly what I told you. I know that font is little, you don't have to read it. I'm not gonna read it now because I would rather engage with you in the time that we have that remains. But you can see there's a sampling of the education of Cyrus the Prince, everything I've just told you, that the course is meant for young people interested in lives of leadership who want to hear not from philosophers. I guess I could say there's nobody who's purely a philosopher on the syllabus. Everybody who's on the syllabus has also lived the political life in some respect. Machiavelli was the second chancellor of the Florentine Republic for 14 years before he sat down to write the books that he wrote. He lived a political life. He would sit face to face with Emperor Maximilian I or the unscrupulous Cesare Borgia. He himself was deeply engaged in politics. You see this in his correspondence, which is, extraordinary. Xenophon himself, of course, a student of Socrates, and for my money, one of the greatest philosophers of the ancient world, but was himself a general who led 10,000 men out of hostile territory. And of course, Frederick Douglass, goes without saying, he's a statesman of a kind without a state. He was never given elected office, and yet he managed to shape politics in a decisive way. And I want the students to see that there are different kinds of ways of shaping politics and being a leader. It doesn't always involve, being elected to formal office. O'Connor, we've discussed, and of course, Teddy. In the semesters when I can, I sometimes include Churchill for reasons I won't discuss. This led to a crazy thing in my life, which is that I'm not a cowboy. Let me just tell y'all, right? I'm not a cowboy. But okay, maybe a little. But when you get to the East Coast, everybody, if you're from Texas, everybody thinks you're a cowboy. And so I have benefited from that and also suffered from it. But word about this got out at a time in the Ivy League when things were going south. Presidents in the Ivy League were being fired. Students were protesting on the lawn. I had given a talk about Douglass and O'Connor and I think Roosevelt for a big group of people. And after that, somebody came up to me and said, hi, I write for Barry Weiss in the Free Press. This is amazing that this is going on right now, given what's going on in the Ivy League, that you're attracting these students to this kind of course with these people when this other stuff, all you hear about in the press is this other stuff. And so they wrote this piece for which I was very grateful. And it at least got word out that this sort of thing was happening. But I'd say to you, I'm not a cowboy, and I feel like in Texas I had to justify it. So I do come from a ranch family. I'm not lying to you. Our ranch is in Skellytown, Texas. These are some photographs of the cowboy who went to Princeton. I don't endorse that, but it's true. in a way, I was born in Brownfield, and so I felt like if I'm coming to Texas and in any way I use the word cowboy, I better justify it. And it's not, Mariana was telling me last night that there are these people who are like lifestyle ranchers. They like move to Austin and retire at 35 and buy a ranch or something like that. That's not what this is. This has been in our family for 100 years. And these guys here are the real cowboys out there working. My cousin and uncle out there working the cattle. And the only concession I could get, I did not want them to put cowboy in it, is that they would put it in quotation marks. So I was really grateful for that. This has led into an extraordinary opportunity that I could never have dreamed of, that I'm really excited about. And that is that I'm going to write a book on this course with Penguin. I could have never envisioned that. You know, I'm much better at communicating to people and students than I am writing academic articles. This is a real opportunity to try to share this message with a large group of people. Who knows when it's going to be done? I hope that that's soon, but it will largely consist of the story that I've told you of the 5 people and their relationships to one another. And it will be a book that will be on sale in Barnes & Noble. Don't worry, it's not for academics only. It's for people, and I love that. I love that aspect of higher education, and I do feel like, especially at Princeton, but I think probably here too, this is an R1. A lot of the times we don't really engage in the public mission, especially of a state university, that we're part of the state and we are supposed to share. It's in a way our obligation to share what we do with large groups of people. And if I can do that in any way, I'm really happy to do it. I'm also starting a podcast with the Free Press. Right now, the idea is that it will be on books that have changed people's lives. So books that you read and you don't just throw them away, but when you have a divorce, when you have a family member die, when you have crisis strike, or when you're changing jobs, when you fall in love, when you have a baby and become a mother or a father, there's that book. Maybe it's I don't know, a Jane Austen book. Maybe it's Tolstoy. Maybe it's Steinbeck. Maybe it's something I've never heard of, a history that you read or a self-help book that you read. I want to hear the story of how a book changed your life and emboldened you and made you richer, and you want to share that book and that story with other people. I want to talk to you about that. So that's, in theory, what this podcast would be about. So I have used my time. I want to thank you. I'm happy to talk with you for the time that we have remaining. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you, Shilo. Yeah, we have like 20 minutes for question, but I think that you kept the promise that I made, that you would have fascinated all of us for an hour, and I didn't dare stopping you. So if you continue for another 15 minutes, I think
appreciate it.
We could. And there's a prediction. I think a lot of biographies are going to be bought right after this class is over, maybe if not now, already on Amazon. So we have some of our students that will ask their question. I only have one, as I usually try to start the conversation, that is related to, the subtitle of this this talk is like, how do we define this greatness that you're talking about? Is it greatness in the eyes of the public? Is it testified by history?
I think I can't answer that question. In other words, that's an open and a live question in the course. And that's something the students are interested in, very much debating. I can say how I viewed it whenever I put this stuff together, and when I'm standing there in my own heart, I try not to, if we were in class, for instance, I wouldn't say what I'm about to say to the students because I want them to make up their own minds. I always tell them, I'm not your teacher, these people are your teacher. Read what they say, make up your mind by yourself. I am not going to color it one way or the other on the most crucial questions of the course. I'm simply a vessel for them. But what I would say is the following. One of the people ask me a lot of times, like, what is it that's common to these people or that sort of thing? These are people who have stood toe-to-toe with the harshest challenges of life and lived to tell about it. And they're great, not in the sense, that even Cyrus, in a way, that Napoleon's great. They're great in the fullness of their humanity. And by that, I mean this, that Theodore Roosevelt writes 23 volumes. His collected works consist of 23 volumes of history that he is overflowing. It's hard enough to be president of the United States, right? It's hard enough to be governor of New York, which he was. It's hard enough to be state assemblyman in New York, which he was. It's hard enough to be secretary of the Navy, which he was. It's hard enough to go and be a Rough Rider, at which he was. But then you got 23 volumes on top of that of stuff, right? Winston Churchill happens to save the world from the specter of Nazism. And oh, by the way, he paints 500 canvases, right? And his collected works are bigger than the two greatest English writers combined, Shakespeare and Dickens. Churchill's works, bigger, more. That's a full man right there who gets all that in life. Think about a man like Abraham Lincoln, the most beautiful literary talent, arguably in American history, up there with Mark Twain and Herman Melville, manages to be Abraham Lincoln in all the political aspects, in addition to educating himself, in addition to these extraordinary literary documents. So to me, there's a certain fullness that's required to rise to these heights. And many of us are mere pieces of that fullness. And I wouldn't take this away from anybody, but you're just a congressman. And now I'm talking about the political class. You're just a congressman, or you happen to be president. I'm not taking away from anything being president. But there's a certain group of people who really do embody the fullness of their humanity. And I say that not just because I love books. I say that because my sense is that fullness guides their political life. And so they're in a way this complete package. And I just want my students to see that at least, that model is compelling. And it's absent in a way from our culture. Our institutions don't really prepare that. Whether it can be taught is not even clear to me. But that is the inner life of these people. And I would say, they don't just struggle in the ways that political people do. Oh, it's a hard decision. Sandra Day O'Connor got breast cancer on the court. You know what she did? She went every day to hear oral arguments with breast cancer, getting chemotherapy. Think about that for a minute. Theodore Roosevelt's mother and wife die on the same day. His wife dies in childbirth. His mother dies a few hours later. If you go back and look at his diaries, there's a big X over that day, and it says, "The light has gone out of my life." He then goes to the American West to find and make the man who's Theodore Roosevelt. Frederick Douglass never knew his mother, never knew who his mother was, except for she would come over when he was really little, sometimes from the neighboring plantation. And he says, "I didn't know her. When she died, I felt the same feeling you would feel as a stranger does when they die, about a stranger who's a friend." His father, he suspected, by the way, was his white master who beat him and everybody else, right? Machiavelli was tortured. He had his wrists bound behind his back in prison. Then a rope was thrown over a beam, tied to his wrists, and the rope was pulled and he was lifted and his shoulders popped out of socket because he was thought to be a part of a conspiracy that we have no evidence he was ever a part of, right? That's suffering, right? Xenophon finds himself in Persia alone with leaderless because the leaders of the army of which he's a part have all been killed or shown themselves to be incompetent, and has to get 10,000 men back to Greece with nothing but hostile people all around him. That's what I have in mind. Those people they didn't just do that. They also wrote books and thought and lived. So that's, to me, what greatness, at least that word is so loaded. You can put it on your book, you can put it on your hat. But to me, that's what it means. Yeah. Oh, please.
Yeah. Do you think there is a difference between political greatness as the classics would have understood it and as the might understand it at a word without it? And do you think that's a difference if it is there, is that relevant to our understanding of these things, or what?
Yeah, so this gets into kind of political theory. I do think that the ancients and the moderns, at least if you were to take as their exemplars like Machiavelli and Xenophon, would disagree. And this is one of the things I try to bring out in my class, is that as much as Machiavelli invokes the classics as a kind of standard for us, there's a radical alteration of their teaching. What you get at the end of the education of Cyrus is, at least in my reading, is the opening of the way for a vindication of virtue. It's been criticized. Cyrus has really manipulated virtue and made it look ugly. But by the time you get to the end, it turns out that the policy of a virtuous polity, which was the Persia from which Cyrus came, and I'm using details you may not be familiar with, that's actually a better policy than arguably than having an emperor who provides for all of us arise. And so there's this notion that, at least in Xenophon, the extraordinary man is not Cyrus perhaps, but his father. That's sometimes how I read it. His father is a man of the city. He's a Persian Republican king who maintains these very strict ways, almost looks like old Sparta. And of course, everyone perhaps is familiar with Aristotle's Ethics and these sorts of classic texts. Machiavelli radically changes all that. Virtue for Machiavelli means lie, cheat, steal, do whatever, I mean, it means a lot of things, but that's kind of the conventional reading. And so I do think that in terms of philosophy, there's a great disagreement. I will say this, though. I've had on this syllabus before George Washington. George Washington, if you look at his private correspondence, he didn't write much, but you look at his private correspondence and you look at what people say about him, was not in search of a Machiavellian kind of virtue. George Washington is sort of the quintessential man of classical virtue in Republican democratic times. So that's in our culture. In other words, sometimes I suspect we're in search as the CEO of a tech company or whatever, of something more Machiavellian. But there is a standard in American history for, and the founders were the bearers of, a kind of classical greatness. And I had a great teacher named Robert Faulkner who wrote a book called The Case for Greatness, Honorable Ambition and Its Critics. And that was his thesis, was that there is an opening for an honorable man of ambition, and that we have that throughout the political philosophic tradition, but also in the American tradition. And so, that's my view of the matter. But it seems to me that the honorable ambition and the kind of greatness of a Washington has fallen out of fashion among the political class. And I don't know that it can be rehabilitated. Don't ask me that question. But anyway, that sheds some light, at least on the inquiry. Yeah. Please.
I had a big question about ambition and statesmanship in books. So a lot of books that you mentioned would be considered classical works of nonfiction. I'm curious, is that like works in literature or fiction or film which you feel like makes a similar point? Perhaps Macbeth comes to mind, Voiding Ambition, things like that.
Yeah, so let me clarify. So there is one work of fiction up here, and that is Xenophon's Education of Cyrus is a wholly fabricated work of historical fiction. Herodotus, in the first book of Herodotus' Histories, writes what many historians, and I'm not convinced Herodotus is getting the historical facts right, but anyway, many historians think that is the historical Cyrus presented there in more or less reality. There's also, if you go, I don't want to get into this, but if you go to archaeology, there's this thing called the Cyrus cylinder, which they found, which is like a chronicle of Cyrus's life on this cylinder, which is broken. Xenophon Greekifies Cyrus. So Xenophon's Cyrus worships the Greek gods. Xenophon's Persia looks like, for lack of a better term, a kind of Sparta, where like guys got shields and there's like Greek armor. Of course, Xenophon reports the speeches of Cyrus and other people. He was not alive when Cyrus was alive. So it is the first historical novel, and it's a beautiful work of an artist. Xenophon is, to me, a poet as much as he's a philosopher, because he writes a beautiful work of fiction that's didactic, not historical in character. So that would be one. I have in the past taught Macbeth in this course, or a version of this course. I've taught, of course, Richard III. I had a great teacher who would often pair Machiavelli and Richard III together, which is wonderful. My standard was really, though, people who have lived a political life. Like I think I don't think that's necessary for the wisdom, but I do think that gets a certain buy-in from the students. When I can say everybody up here is not just talking about, you should go take political theory. I'm a political theorist, but I wanted to present them with this new angle. So to answer your question, yes, I have thought about, unfortunately it's too long, but I might do a seminar on Robert Penn Warren, All the King's Men, which is a beautiful novel. One of the things I'm thinking about is a sequel to this, because you can imagine these students are like, what do I do next? This has been great. There's no sequel. So I thought about doing a seminar on failure, like people who have just totally failed, just complete collapse. And that might include some more works of fiction, but yes, I do think about it all the time. Yeah.
I guess a question that, I was thinking about Mr. Smith goes to Washington as far as he shuts somebody in statesmanship. He cares more about state than their internal ambitions. What is there like a guiding compass, I guess, some of these getting you're talking about where I guess their lives will done, and that looks like there was any extreme suffering that brought out greatness in them. It's almost like they wanted to make their life more meaningful to others rather than just kind of sitting on their own pedestal and being worshipped for whatever they've accomplished.
Yeah. So in a way you're asking, have I deliberately selected people, all of whom are in their own ways public spirited? Was that what, I mean, yeah, I mean, yes, first of all, I do want the students to see, I think it's a danger of courses, it could be a great danger of this course that you come away thinking the course is really an instruction manual about how to win friends and whatever the other, what's the guy's book? Influence people. That's not what the course is about. The course is, after all, in the great tradition of political philosophy, meant to pose the question of what the common good is and what your role as somebody who has ambition is in a polity which aims towards some standard of the common good. And so that does come out over the arc of the course by way of each of these authors in their own way devoting themselves to, or in the case of Machiavelli and Xenophon, philosophizing about the meaning of that good. This comes up especially in The Education of Cyrus, where Cyrus rises to the heights of the greatest man ever to have ruled anyone ever on the basis of the premise that he is a benefactor to his people and they are better off as a consequence of his leadership. And yet at the same time, what that ends up doing is addicting them to his gifts, such that when he gets to a point when he can no longer give them gifts, the only way he can command their obedience is, by demeaning them and taking their freedom away. And so that provides us an occasion for a deep reflection on the common good. I mean, the same would be true with honor, that in a way, honor is given as a reward for devotion to the common good, and yet when the proper soul, when the kind of grandly ambitious soul is offered the opportunity to acquire honor, there's no reason why that person shouldn't be so greedy about honor or wouldn't be so greedy about honor that they want the honor of being above everyone. In other words, they want their honor to be so high that they are, we've now created a monster with our honor economy by way of somebody who wants it so bad that they're willing to, in a way, put down the others as a consequence. So, these questions and themes do come up throughout the course. And I'll say this, I mean, one of the things I try to show the students is that in more or less clarity, each of these people has a kind of set of principles. They may be incoherent in some cases, they may not be clearly articulated in some cases, but there's a set of principles generally that they abide by, that they articulate. It's sometimes harder to tease out of O'Connor because she's really trying to be a justice. But Theodore Roosevelt, for example, is just open about he has this great section in his autobiography that he calls here's how you become a person who has, I love this term, would you believe he used it in the early 1900s, the right stuff. What does it mean to be a person with the right stuff? And it's this whole articulation of the meaning of having character and, being a person of fortitude and all these sorts of things. And Frederick Douglass has the same sorts of reflections on the question of what it means to be a free person. And so I do try to bring out both the problem of the common good, the problem of being desirous of honor and what that means for the common good, and the idea that each of these thinkers has some moral orientation or immoral orientation on the basis of which they are functioning. And then we need to pass judgment and weigh those things and put them in a conversation with each other. Eric.
Yeah, I'm just curious about whether you get any resistance from students to the approach you're taking in this class and what kind of shape it takes. Like I can imagine in great books and old great books,
Yeah.
curriculum being popular with everybody's selection of authors. I'm just kind of curious about what sorts of criticism.
So I did get, I haven't gotten a ton of criticism, but I did get students who, I heard a rumor that some of the students felt like they had been hoodwinked for this reason, that under the guise of a course on the subject matter, what they got were the great books. But is O'Connor in the great books? I mean, you went to St. John, that's not, yeah. Yeah, Roosevelt, not in the great book. So you get a taste, right? I want them to get a taste because of what Roosevelt said about you need to read Gibbon and Macaulay and you need to get a taste for the good things. So, but those students largely stick around. And I confess this, that this better than I do, Eric, that teaching is a kind of, this is now a Socratic insight, and I don't mean this to sound perverse, a kind of seduction, right, in a way. And so one of the ways I get them to stick around is, our friend Devin Stauffer who teaches here, says this about teaching. You have to play the instrument you are. Whatever instrument you are, you play the instrument you are, he plays the instrument, and we're all different instruments, you know what I mean? And so one of the things I'm able to do is play the instrument I am, such that even if they think And the James Madison program, for instance, has a reputation for being conservative. Robbie's at the top, whatever the case may be. I still got 260 kids at the most progressive university on the East Coast coming to my class. The reason is that I'm able to play the instrument that I am. When I get up there and talk, they can feel the passion. They can feel, and so they're willing to trust me. They're willing to say, maybe he's on the right. They don't know. I don't even know. Maybe he's a con artist, whatever the case may be. But when he gets up there, it's like a revival. I mean, I've got the book out. It's like a big, I mean, that's what it's like, but rather not the Bible, but with the great book, with great ideas, you know what I mean? And so a lot of them just come for the spectacle and stay for the edification, you know? So yeah, please.
Follow it then, Alex, and I'm curious about, is your sense that your students are, it's probably going to be a mix of these, or largely progressives who have gotten curious about this for some reason or another, or a conservative minority at Princeton who want an alternative?
Yeah, it is a mix of those. One of the things that I got, so let me just say, one of the reasons that so many different types come to the class is that I got, and I would encourage everybody who's building new programs to do this. I've gotten the courses to count for some general ed requirements. So students are willing to take a chance on it because at least it will, fulfill something. But let me answer the particular question. I think the assumption about me is, of course, this is the James Madison program and he's going to be of this kind. That goes out the window pretty quickly when, Xenophon and Machiavelli and Nietzsche, all these sorts of things come up. So I think the way the balance works at our university is that we have a group of kids who really love the Madison program. There's a group of kids who are there because they love Robbie and they really see what an extraordinary scholar he is and want to learn from him and with him. But there's a lot of people I suspect on campus who are, who wouldn't, they think he's something else. They would never take a course. I consider myself, at least what I suspect could be going on is that I'm kind of the Diet Coke. Like, they're like, all right, well, maybe, maybe he's like a little younger. He doesn't like, he's not having public profile. And I've heard that I need to take courses with people who might think differently than me. And all right, I'll take it. And another kid said it was good. So, I think that I'm able to occupy a place where I don't offend, I satisfy and stupefy and edify at the same time. And so I get a lot of those kids. And I'll say this, this ambition knows no political party. If there's something that I might be able to teach them or offer them that they think will get them ahead at Princeton, they're going to take it, regardless of whoever I am. So I think a lot of those things mix together. Let me say one more thing. I don't read my teaching evaluations because the thing I fear most is praise. I don't fear criticism. I don't want praise. I learned that from Cyrus. There's something about praise that can distort your psychology such that you become addicted to it in ways that lead you down all sorts of paths. So I never read my teaching evaluations because I fear the positive ones. What I do, though, is have students come into my office and they'll say, end of the semester, my favorite part of this course, and I get this all the time, was we read full books. I've never done that here. I'm like, you've never done that here? This is Princeton? We read full books. And in Xenophon's case, we spent 5 weeks on that book. And they're like, I have never in my education been able to go 10 pages at a time, ever. There's nobody else at the university that's really offering that other than a handful of people. So that I've been surprised. Of course, that cuts across all political lines. The students really like the intimacy that they can get with a prolonged, sustained reflection on a thinker, or 4 or 3. That's like, wholly new. And I suspect the reason for that is that teaching takes, you're, a celebrated teacher. Many of your students have come and told me that. Teaching takes, in a way, the scholars at Princeton are the best in the world. Their scholarship colors their teaching such that it becomes a literature review the whole semester. It's just a giant literature review. When the students come to me, I want to show them what it means to be a teacher. By these people, first of all, being our teachers, but second, by me not bombarding them with disciplinary, acquaintance with the arguments, but just trying to show them what it means to have a sustained reflection on ideas. And I think that's not popular anymore. And requirements for tenure and promotion don't always incentivize that. I don't blame the faculty. I blame the institutional structures that train teachers in a way.
Okay, last question.
Yeah.
So a question on the inclusion of Machiavellian.
Okay.
Everyone but Machiavelli seems to have a fairly coherent understanding of justice in the words.
Yeah.
So, for instance, the fitting club and textbook in the Syrup they have versus Machiavelli's Constitution, nevertheless, to bypass more questions surrounding justice that part of it tradition would have been addressed it.
Yeah.
And there were plenty of respondents to Machiavelli in Spain, Italy, Bolero, Era, Chile, who had the same sort of great man idea, great plans, but included a coherent system of justice in their instruction, their Maryland literature. So, and we somewhat brushed on this earlier, I think, but why the influence of Machiavelli, and there may be alternatives to spawned out of this tradition to unite Kratos and Peter.
Yeah, because here's the reason, because I'm not a teacher of morality. In other words, I'm not there to tell you how you should live. I want to present you with alternatives. And so I don't want a consistent moral message. I would like to confuse you. It's possible Machiavelli's right and all the people who love justice are dupes. And I would like for us to entertain that. And I would also like for us to entertain the way in Machiavelli that necessity takes the place of justice. That's a pretty compelling argument, and it's alive in politics, nowhere more than in international affairs. So I think just as a kind of course that orients students toward how they ought to think about these matters, Machiavelli is, is a necessary inclusion because he challenges the received wisdom. And if I just got up there and, thumb to the moral Bible and just say, that's not that interesting. And it's also not yet liberal education. And so that's one reason for it. The other thing I have to do with the students oftentimes is clear up the cartoon or the caricature of Machiavelli, because, and I think as a good teacher, you have to give some of that. You want to participate in the cartoon. Like I love being the cartoon of Machiavelli, but I always have to tell them, because they say, oh, well, Machiavelli is clearly just immoral, thoroughgoing. And maybe he is, but what Machiavelli actually says is, or at least what I take him to be implying, is that one wouldn't want to be cruel or be mean or be, illiberal or unless necessity demanded it. If you were just that way all the time, that would be a disaster for you and you would not be able to maintain your state. So Machiavelli seems to be more complicated than the cartoon, which is like, you should be evil and deceive all the time and never keep your word. No, what you should do is do those things when they're necessary, and when they're not necessary, don't do them because they might cost you your state. Now that's that may ultimately redound in injustice, and I don't deny that, but it's also a kind of more complicated consideration. So that's why he's there. And he also, the fact that Roosevelt, of all the people in the world, wrote a little essay on Machiavelli is kind of astonishing. Like, imagine an American president in the past 30 years writing an essay on Machiavelli. That just, So anyway, that's why.
Well, let's all thank.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if you're not on the newsletter, just subscribe so you will know when we have other speakers. I don't know they're going to be as good.
Probably will. Yeah.